The morning mist clung to the cemetery stones like forgotten prayers. Sera Ashwood stood alone among the graves, her pale blonde hair catching the weak autumn sunlight that filtered through the bare branches overhead. 3 years had passed since they buried grandmother Liana, yet the wound remained fresh, a constant ache beneath her ribs that never quite healed. Around her, the Eastern Pack gathered for the annual memorial service, their bodies forming a loose semicircle of obligation rather than grief. Most had already forgotten the old healer who'd tended their wounds and eased their suffering for 5 decades. To them, Liana was simply another name carved in weathered stone, another sacrifice claimed by the hard years following the Great War. But Sera remembered everything. The gentle hands that had taught her which herbs stopped bleeding and which ones eased pain. The patient voice explaining how bone knit itself back together, given time and proper setting. The workshops filled with the scent of dried lavender and crushed willow bark, where sunlight through dusty windows turned ordinary medicine into something close to magic. Alpha Garrett Stonehaven stood before the gathered pack, his broad shoulders draped in ceremonial furs despite the mild weather. His voice carried across the cemetery with practiced authority, each word measured and proper. "We gather today to honor those who serve the Eastern Pack with dedication and sacrifice. Liana Ashwood gave her life in service to our people, tending our sick, healing our wounded, preserving the knowledge passed down through generations. Her loss diminished us all." The words were correct, respectful, utterly hollow. Sera's hands clenched at her sides, hidden within the folds of her plain gray dress. The same dress she wore for every pack gathering, the uniform of her diminished status. Once, she had worn the apprentice healer's green, marked as Liana's successor. That had ended 3 years ago, on the night of her claiming ceremony, when her wolf had refused to emerge and everything she'd worked for turned to ash. The ceremony continued. Garrett's daughter Celeste placed a wreath of autumn flowers on the grave, her movements graceful and deliberate, calculated to appear both dutiful and beautiful. At 25, Celeste embodied everything an alpha's daughter should be: strong, confident, ambitious. Her wolf had manifested powerfully at her claiming, marking her as potential alpha material in her own right. She caught Sera's eye as she returned to her place among the pack elite, and something cold flickered in her gaze before she looked away. Dismissal. The broken Omega wasn't worth sustained attention. The blessing of the dead concluded with the traditional howl, voices rising in unison to honor the fallen. Sera's throat remained silent. She had no wolf voice to join the chorus, no way to participate in even this simple ritual. Around her, the sound swelled and echoed among the stones before dying away, leaving only the whisper of wind through dead leaves. The pack dispersed quickly after that, eager to return to the warmth of the main hall where food and drink awaited. Memorial services were somber duty, but the feast afterward offered compensation. Sera remained by the grave as the others filed past, their conversations already turning to lighter topics, to gossip and plans, and the ordinary concerns of pack life. Mira paused beside her, one hand briefly touching Sera's shoulder. Her friend's presence offered what comfort it could, a small island of warmth in a sea of indifference. Mira was beta-born, properly placed within the pack hierarchy, but she'd never treated Sera with the contempt that others showed. Their friendship was quiet, careful, conducted in the spaces between official pack business where the broken Omega might be momentarily forgotten. "Come to the hall when you're ready," Mira said softly. "I saved you bread from breakfast." The kindness of it, the casual assumption that Sera might be hungry, that her needs mattered enough for someone to consider them, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back and nodded, not trusting her voice. After Mira left, Sera knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters of her grandmother's name. The stone was cool beneath her touch, solid and permanent in a way that living things could never be. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why did you let me think I was broken?" Memory rose unbidden. Liana's face in those final hours, pale and drawn with pain that went beyond physical suffering. She'd gripped Sera's hand with surprising strength, her breathing labored and wrong, her lips forming words that made no sense. "Your wolf sleeps because I asked her to." The voice echoed across 3 years, as clear as if Liana spoke beside her now. When the time comes, forgive me for the choice I made." Sera had thought it was delirium, the confused rambling of a dying mind. The pack healers who'd examined Liana afterwards spoke of heart failure, a sudden collapse of a system worn thin by decades of service. Natural causes. Unfortunate but inevitable. But Liana's eyes had been clear in those final moments, focused with terrible intensity. She'd pressed something into Sera's palm, closing the girl's fingers around it with desperate urgency. The wooden pendant, carved in the shape of a wolf, with its head raised to an invisible moon. Liana had worn it every day for as long as Sera could remember, the wood polished smooth by decades of touch. "Keep it close," Liana had whispered. "Hide the light, little one. They're coming. The hunters know." Then her eyes had closed, her breathing had stopped, and within an hour, she was gone. The healers had taken the body away. The pack had held the funeral 3 days later. Life had continued, as it always did, leaving Sera alone with questions that had no answers, and a grief that time refused to diminish. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and made her way toward the main hall. The path wound through the forest that surrounded their territory, old growth trees that had stood since before the Great War. Their roots ran deep into earth that remembered older times, when the world had been different and wolves had lived by laws that no longer applied. The sound of the feast reached her before the building came into view. Laughter and conversation, the clatter of plates and cups, the warmth of pack bonds that she would never fully share. She slipped in through the kitchen entrance, the servants' door, and immediately felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle over her shoulders. The kitchen staff barely glanced her way. To them, she was simply another pair of hands, useful for carrying heavy trays or scrubbing stubborn pots. Matron Iris Thornfield ruled the kitchen with iron efficiency, her sharp eyes missing nothing and forgiving even less. "You're late," the older woman said without preamble. "Take these platters to the main hall, and try not to drop anything this time." The reference to a months-old accident made Sera's cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral and accepted the heavy silver trays. The platters were laden with roasted meats and autumn vegetables, the finest food the pack could offer, prepared to demonstrate their prosperity and strength. Never mind that many of the lower-ranking families struggled to keep meat on their own tables. Appearances mattered more than reality, especially when hosting important guests. Important guests. The phrase echoed in Sera's mind as she pushed through the swinging door into the main hall. She'd heard whispers among the staff about a visitor coming, someone significant enough to warrant this elaborate memorial feast. But no one had explained the details to a broken Omega whose opinions didn't matter. The great hall blazed with light from hundreds of candles mounted in iron sconces along the walls. Tapestries depicting ancient hunts and legendary battles hung between the windows, their colors rich and vibrant in the golden glow. The long wooden tables were crowded with pack members, faces flushed with wine and good food, voices rising in competition with one another. At the high table, positioned on a raised platform at the hall's far end, sat the pack's leadership. Alpha Garrett occupied the central chair, larger and more ornate than the others. To his right sat Celeste, beautiful in a gown of deep crimson that set off her dark hair and pale skin. The Beta Council members filled the remaining seats, each one a wolf of power and influence. And beside Garrett, in the place of honor typically reserved for visiting alphas or the most important pack elders, sat a man Sera had never seen before. He was tall, even seated, his shoulders broad beneath a cloak of midnight blue lined with silver fur. Dark hair pulled back from a face that looked carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard planes. But it was his eyes that stopped her mid-step, winter blue and piercing, the kind of gaze that saw through pretense and deception to the truth beneath. Those eyes swept the room with methodical precision, cataloging faces and positions, assessing threats and alliances with the instinct of a born predator. When they passed over Sera, she felt the touch of that attention like a physical thing, cold and evaluating. Then they moved on, and she could breathe again. She made her way between the tables, her footsteps silent on the rush-covered floor, the platters balanced with the ease of long practice. No one looked at her directly. To the pack members enjoying their feast, she was simply part of the background, no more worthy of notice than the serving tables or the candles overhead. Beta Ravens Blackwood sat near the center of the hall, surrounded by his cronies, all of them loud with wine and self-importance. He was young for a beta, only 28, but he'd risen quickly through the ranks by being ruthless where others showed mercy, by seeing weakness as something to exploit rather than protect. As Sera passed his table, carrying a fresh platter of roasted venison, Ravens deliberately shifted his weight, extending his leg into her path. She saw it coming, but had no time to adjust, not with the heavy platter in her hands. Her foot caught his ankle and she stumbled, fighting for balance. The platter tilted dangerously. Meat slid toward the edge. For one horrible moment she was certain everything would crash to the floor, that she would be humiliated before the entire pack and this mysterious visitor whose presence commanded such careful preparation. But she'd been carrying heavy loads since she was 10 years old, training muscles and reflexes that no formal warrior education could match. Her arms corrected the angle, her body found its center of gravity, and the platter steadied. Nothing fell, nothing broke. Ravens laughed anyway, a harsh sound that drew attention from the nearby tables. "Watch yourself, broken one. Wouldn't want you embarrassing us in front of our honored guest with your clumsiness." The words were calculated to humiliate, to mark her as defective before witnesses. Several pack members joined Raven's laughter, while others looked away, unwilling to defend her but uncomfortable with such casual cruelty. Sera kept her eyes down and continued toward the high table. Engaging would only make things worse. Ravens wanted a reaction, wanted to see her flinch or fight back so he could justify further punishment. She'd learned years ago that the only winning move was not to play. But her hands trembled slightly as she set the platter on the high table, and she hated herself for that small show of weakness. "Your Majesty," Garrett was saying, his voice pitched to carry just far enough to demonstrate his authority without seeming to shout. "I trust the journey was comfortable. Our territories may be smaller than yours, but we pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards of hospitality." The stranger's response was quiet, forcing Garrett to lean forward slightly to hear. Sera caught only fragments as she arranged the platters with careful precision. "Your hospitality is appreciated, Alpha Garrett, though I confess my journey had purposes beyond pleasure." Something in his voice made Sera's hands still. It was deep and measured, each word chosen with deliberate care, but underneath ran currents of authority so profound that even Garrett's alpha dominance seemed diminished by comparison. This was not simply a powerful wolf. This was something older, something that remembered when the world operated by different rules. Sera risked a glance upward as she stepped back from the table. The stranger was watching Garrett with those winter blue eyes, patient and assessing. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but she recognized the coiled readiness of a warrior who never fully lowered his guard. Then his gaze shifted, and before she could look away, their eyes met. The world seemed to stop. Not the dramatic, romantic freezing of time that legends spoke of, but something stranger and more unsettling. His eyes widened fractionally, surprise breaking through his carefully controlled expression. His nostrils flared as if catching an unexpected scent, and for just a moment she felt something stir within her, a presence that had been dormant for so long she'd believed it truly dead. A spark, a whisper, the faintest suggestion of golden light behind her eyes. Then it was gone, and she was simply a broken omega standing before the high table, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. The stranger continued to stare at her, and the weight of his attention made her skin prickle. Around them, conversation faltered as others noticed the direction of his gaze. Garrett frowned, confused by this break in protocol. "Your Majesty, is something wrong?" The stranger blinked, and his expression smoothed back into neutrality. But when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of command that made every wolf in the hall sit straighter. "Who is she?" The question fell into sudden silence. Every eye in the great hall turned toward Sera, and she felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical blow. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear back into the kitchen and the blessed anonymity of service. But her feet remained frozen to the floor, trapped by a gaze that would not release her. Garrett's frown deepened. "Your Majesty refers to the girl who just served us, the one with pale hair. Who is she?" Understanding dawned on Garrett's face, followed immediately by embarrassment that quickly shifted toward anger. He gestured dismissively, not quite looking at Sera directly. "She is no one of importance, Your Majesty, simply a serving girl. Her name is Sera Ashwood, and she—" His voice took on a note of apology, as if her very existence was an offense that required explanation. "She is a defective omega, failed to manifest her wolf during the claiming ceremony 3 years ago. We keep her on out of charity, give her work in the kitchens and serving at feasts. She's harmless, if unfortunate. The humiliation of being discussed as if she weren't standing right there, of having her deepest shame laid out before a stranger and the entire pack, made Sera's vision blur. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, willing herself to become invisible, to disappear into the shadows where broken things belonged. But the stranger wasn't finished. His next words changed everything. "Bring her to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen sounds from the far end of the hall seemed to fade, as if the entire world held its breath. Garrett's face went pale, then flushed dark with confusion and mounting distress. "Your Majesty, surely we have many fine members of our pack who would be honored to— I don't understand your interest in—" "I did not ask for your understanding, Alpha Garrett." The stranger's voice remained perfectly level, but something in it made even Garrett's alpha authority seem like a candle flame before the sun. "I asked for her. Now." Ravens appeared at Sera's elbow so suddenly she nearly gasped. His fingers closed around her upper arm with bruising force, nails digging into flesh hard enough to leave marks. His breath, hot and wine-sour, brushed her ear as he leaned close. "You heard the king," he hissed, venom in every syllable. "Move!" He hauled her forward, not gently, his grip designed to hurt and humiliate. She stumbled on the raised platform's edge, nearly falling before catching herself. Ravens shoved her the final few feet and released her so suddenly she swayed, off balance and disoriented. She stood before the high table, before this man they called king, and finally understood the magnitude of who sat in their hall. Not simply a visiting alpha, not just a powerful wolf from a neighboring territory. King Theron Silvercrest, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of the oldest and strongest pack confederation in the known world. A wolf whose authority superseded that of every other alpha, whose word could end conflicts or start wars, whose very presence in their modest hall was honor beyond measure. And he was staring at her as if she were the most important thing in the room. "Your Majesty," Garrett tried again, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure, "I must protest this irregularity. The girl has no standing, no worth to offer someone of your position. If this is some jest—" "Do I look as if I am jesting, Alpha Garrett?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Garrett's mouth opened, then closed. He shook his head mutely. "Good!" King Theron's attention returned to Sera, and she felt pinned by that winter-blue gaze like a butterfly on a collector's board. "What is your name?" Sera managed to force words past the tightness in her throat. "Sera Ashwood, Your Majesty." He said her name slowly, as if tasting each syllable. Sera Ashwood, Lyanna's granddaughter. The surprise of hearing her grandmother's name spoken by this stranger, said with a note of something that might have been respect, loosened her paralysis enough that she looked up fully for the first time. "You knew my grandmother, Your Majesty?" Something that wasn't quite a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I knew of her. Lyanna Ashwood was renowned even beyond your territories. A healer of exceptional skill and knowledge, one of the few who maintained the old practices." His expression grew more serious. "I was saddened to hear of her passing. The world has fewer lights in it with her gone." The acknowledgement, the genuine note of loss in his voice when speaking of a woman he'd apparently never met, cracked something in Sera's carefully maintained composure. Tears pricked her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, aware of the entire pack watching this bizarre exchange. "Thank you, Your Majesty. She would have been honored by your words." "Would she?" King Theron studied her with unsettling intensity. Or would she have been troubled that her granddaughter serves in kitchens rather than continuing her work? The question was too pointed, too accurate. Sera's throat tightened further. "I was forbidden from practicing healing after my failed claiming ceremony, Your Majesty. The pact determined I was unfit for such responsibilities." "And do you believe that assessment was correct?" No one had ever asked her that. Not once in 3 years had anyone questioned whether the pact's judgment was just or accurate. They had simply declared it, and it had become truth, immutable as the stones beneath their feet. Sera opened her mouth to give the expected answer, the submissive agreement that would end this uncomfortable attention and allow her to retreat back to safety. Instead, she heard herself say, "No, Your Majesty, I do not." The collective intake of breath from the assembled pack was audible. Even Garrett looked shocked, his hand moving as if to signal the guards. but King Theron raised one hand slightly, a gesture that froze every wolf in place without a word being spoken. His expression didn't change, but something that might have been approval flickered in those winter eyes. "Then you and I have something in common, Sera Ashwood. We both question judgments that others accept without thought." He stood in one fluid motion, his height impressive, his presence filling the space around him like a force of nature. The midnight blue cloak fell in perfect folds around broad shoulders. He was not young, Sera realized. His face bore the marks of experience, faint scars along his jaw and temple, lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent in sun and wind. But he moved with the easy grace of a wolf in his prime, and his eyes held the weight of far more years than his appearance suggested. "Alpha Garrett," King Theron said without looking away from Sera, "I will require private quarters tonight. We have matters to discuss that require discretion." "Of course, Your Majesty," Garrett stammered, clearly thrown by the rapid shifts in conversation. "We've prepared our finest rooms in the eastern wing." "Excellent." The king's gaze finally released Sera, turning to sweep the room. "The feast was well prepared, and your hospitality is noted. But I find myself fatigued from travel. I will retire early." He took 2 steps toward the hall's exit, then paused. His next words fell like stones into still water. "Sera Ashwood will show me to my quarters." The explosion of reaction was immediate. Garrett surged to his feet, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and barely suppressed fury. Celeste's hand clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Ravens, still standing nearby, made a strangled sound of protest. "Your Majesty," Garrett's voice cracked slightly, his control slipping. "This is highly irregular. Perhaps one of our senior betas or my daughter Celeste would be more appropriate to—" "I have made my choice." King Theron's tone allowed no argument. "Unless you are suggesting that a member of your pack cannot be trusted to perform so simple a task?" The trap was elegant. To protest further would be to admit that either Sera posed some danger, which would reflect poorly on pack security, or that Garrett questioned the king's judgment, which bordered on insubordination. Garrett's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to force out, "Of course not, Your Majesty. Sera will show you to your quarters." King Theron nodded once and turned toward the doors. Sera followed because there was no other choice, her mind reeling, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. Behind them, shocked whispers erupted like wildfire. She caught fragments as she passed. What is he thinking? Broken Omega? Insult to proper wolves? What game is this? Mira's face in the crowd, eyes wide with confusion and worry. Celeste's expression, frozen in a rictus of jealous fury. Raven's glare, promising future retribution for this inexplicable elevation. And then they were through the doors, into the cool air of the corridor beyond, and the weight of those stairs finally lifted from Sera's shoulders. She walked several paces ahead of King Theron, as protocol demanded, leading him through passages she'd traversed thousands of times. The eastern wing housed the finest guest quarters, rooms reserved for visiting alphas and important dignitaries. She'd cleaned them often enough, scrubbing floors and beating rugs, but had never expected to enter them except as a servant. Her mind raced with questions she didn't dare voice. Why had he singled her out? What could an Alpha King possibly want with a broken Omega? Was this some elaborate humiliation, designed to teach her a lesson about presuming above her station? They reached the ornate double doors that marked the entrance to the main guest suite. Sera pushed them open, revealing a spacious chamber dominated by a massive hearth where a fire had already been laid. Rich tapestries covered the walls, and the bed was piled high with furs and fine linens. King Theron entered and surveyed the room with the same methodical attention he'd given the feast hall. Checking for threats, Sera realized. Even here, in the heart of Allied territory, he never fully lowered his guard. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. "Your Majesty," Sera said quietly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "If you require anything else, I can summon the household staff. I require answers." His voice was closer than she'd expected, and she looked up to find him standing only a few feet away, studying her with that same unsettling intensity. "And I suspect you have questions of your own." Sera's hands twisted together nervously. "With respect, Your Majesty, I don't understand what's happening. Why did I single you out before your entire pack? Why did I demand your presence here?" He moved to the hearth, his back to her, firelight casting his profile in stark relief. "Because from the moment you entered that hall, I sensed something that shouldn't exist in a wolf who supposedly cannot shift." He turned, and his eyes seemed to glow in the flickering light. "I came to this territory investigating reports of land corruption, of dying forests and poisoned waters. I expected to find dark magic, forbidden practices, perhaps a rogue practitioner trying to enhance pack strength through dangerous means. Instead, I found you. And from you emanates a signature of power so pure, so old, that it took my breath away." His voice dropped lower. "You are not broken, Sera Ashwood. You are dormant. And if what I suspect is true, you are the first of your kind I've encountered in nearly a century." The words made no sense. Sera shook her head, confusion overwhelming the fear that had been her constant companion. "I don't understand, Your Majesty. The healers examined me. I failed the claiming ceremony. My wolf never emerged. I'm defective. Or your wolf never needed to emerge because you are something else entirely." King Theron moved closer, and she caught his scent for the first time, pine and snow, and something wild that made that dormant presence within her stir again, stronger this time. "Tell me, when was the last time you entered the forest alone?" The question seemed random, disconnected from everything else. Sera struggled to remember. "Years, Your Majesty. Not since before my failed ceremony. After that, I avoided the forest. It hurt too much, being there where I could feel other wolves running free while I remained trapped in human form." "And your grandmother's workshop? When did you last visit it?" Sera's breath caught. "Not since she died, Your Majesty." Alpha Garrett had it locked. He said the old healing methods were superstitious nonsense, that modern medicine was sufficient. Something dangerous flashed across King Theron's face. Of course he did, because knowledge is power, and power in the wrong hands threatens those who rule through force rather than wisdom. He was close enough now that she could see the silver scars that marked his face, earned in battles she couldn't imagine. Old eyes and a face that appeared middle-aged, carrying the weight of experiences that spanned decades beyond what they should. "Sera Ashwood," he said quietly, "would you like to know what you truly are? Would you like to understand why your grandmother hid your power, why she died trying to protect you, why the Pack's judgment was not just wrong, but deliberately blind?" "Yes," she whispered, though part of her was terrified of the answer. "Then tomorrow we go into the forest, just you and I will show you something that your Pack has forgotten, that your grandmother tried to preserve, that the world needs desperately to remember." He stepped back, releasing her from the intensity of his proximity. "Go now, rest. Tomorrow changes everything. And Sera?" She paused at the door, looking back. King Theron's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "Wear something appropriate for riding. Where we're going, servants' dresses won't suffice." She fled then, her mind a chaos of confusion and hope and terror. Behind her, the door closed softly, leaving King Theron alone with the fire and whatever thoughts commanded his attention. In her small room in the servants' quarters, Sera sat on her narrow bed and pulled her grandmother's pendant from beneath her dress. The wooden wolf seemed to glow in the moonlight streaming through her window, its carved eyes knowing and sad. "Hide the light, little one." Lyanna's final words echoed in memory. "The hunters know." For the first time, Sera wondered if those words hadn't been delirium at all, but warning. And if King Theron Silvercrest, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, had come seeking her specifically, what did that mean for the fragile safety she'd built in the shadows of her Pack's contempt? She held the pendant tight and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would indeed change everything, though whether for better or worse, only the morning would reveal. Dawn arrived cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Sera stood at her window, watching the light spread across the forest canopy, and wondered if this would be the last morning she woke as the person she'd always believed herself to be. Sleep had been impossible. She'd spent the night turning King Theron's words over in her mind, examining them from every angle like a jeweler studying a stone for flaws. "You are not broken. You are dormant." The words offered hope she'd taught herself not to feel, promised answers to questions she'd been forbidden to ask. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find a young woman wearing the emblem of the Northern Territories, her arms laden with folded fabric. "By order of His Majesty," the woman said, her tone professional but not unkind, "you're to wear these today. She deposited the bundle on Sera's bed and departed before Sera could form questions. The clothing was finer than anything she'd owned since before her failed ceremony. Soft leather breeches in deep brown, a cream linen shirt, and a fitted jacket of forest green with subtle silver embroidery at the cuffs. There were also boots of supple leather and a belt of braided cord. The message was clear. Today she would not dress as a servant. Today she would ride beside a king, and her appearance must reflect that elevation, however temporary it might prove. She dressed slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened buckles and tied laces. The clothing fit as if made for her, though she couldn't imagine how such perfect measurements had been obtained. The jacket hugged her waist in a way her shapeless servant's dresses never had, and the breeches allowed freedom of movement she'd almost forgotten was possible. When she caught her reflection in the small mirror above her washing basin, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back had Sera's face, but carried herself differently. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes that met her own gaze instead of sliding away. She touched her grandmother's pendant, where it rested beneath the linen shirt, drawing strength from the familiar weight against her skin. Whatever this day brought, Liana had prepared her for it in ways she was only beginning to understand. The courtyard was already alive with activity when she emerged. Stable hands led horses from the barn, their breath steaming in the morning air. Pack members moved with purpose, preparing for the hunt that Alpha Garrett had organized to honor their royal guest. King Theron stood near the mounting blocks, speaking quietly with one of his guards. He wore riding clothes similar to her own, though in darker colors, and the silver clasp at his throat bore the crest of the Northern Territories. His dark hair was pulled back from his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of jaw and cheekbone, the winter blue eyes that seemed to see through surface appearances to deeper truths. Those eyes found her immediately, and something that might have been approval flickered across his features. He dismissed his guard with a gesture and approached, his movements fluid and economical, a warrior's economy of motion that wasted no energy. "You look ready," he said simply. "Can you ride?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The answer came more steadily than she'd expected. "My grandmother taught me. We would ride into the forest to gather herbs before they decided you were broken and took that from you as well." His voice carried an edge that spoke of controlled anger. "We will reclaim what was stolen today, Sera Ashwood, one piece at a time." Alpha Garrett appeared, flanked by Beta Ravens and several council members. His expression was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from his frame like heat from a forge. "Your Majesty, we're honored you've chosen to join our hunt. We've tracked a large stag in the eastern woods that should provide sport worthy of your skill." King Theron's gaze didn't waver from Sera. "I appreciate the offer, Alpha Garrett, but I have other business this morning. Sera will accompany me on a private survey of your territory. We'll rejoin the hunt party by midday." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Garrett's carefully maintained composure cracked, confusion and displeasure warring across his features. "Your Majesty, surely you would prefer the company of experienced wolves. The girl has no training for wilderness travel. She could be a liability." "She rides with me." King Theron's tone remained conversational, but something in it made even Garrett's alpha authority seem diminished. "I take full responsibility for her safety, unless you're suggesting your territory is too dangerous for your own pack members to traverse." The trap was elegant and inescapable. Garrett's jaw worked soundlessly before he managed to force out words. "Of course not, Your Majesty. Our lands are perfectly safe. It's simply unusual." "Many things are unusual until they become common." King Theron turned to a stable hand. "Bring the chestnut mare, the one with the gentle temperament." Within moments, a beautiful horse was led forward, her coat the color of autumn leaves, her eyes intelligent and calm. The mare regarded Sera with what seemed like curiosity, nostrils flaring to catch her scent. Sera approached slowly, remembering Liana's lessons. Always let them know you first. Horses sense fear, but they also sense respect. She extended her hand, palm up, allowing the mare to investigate. The horse's soft nose touched her palm, warm breath ghosting across her skin. Then the mare nudged her shoulder gently, a gesture that felt like acceptance. "Her name is Ember," King Theron said. "She has carried queens and warriors. Today she carries you." Sera mounted with more grace than she'd expected, muscle memory returning after years of disuse. The saddle felt right beneath her, the reins familiar in her hands. Ember shifted slightly, testing this new rider, then settled when Sera's legs applied gentle pressure. King Theron swung onto his own mount, a massive black stallion that towered over the other horses. The animal was clearly bred for war, all power and controlled aggression, but it responded to its rider with the precision of long partnership. "We'll return by midday," King Theron said to Garrett, already turning his horse toward the forest path. "Continue your hunt. Enjoy your sport." They rode out of the courtyard together, leaving behind a tableau of confused faces and whispered speculation. Sera felt the weight of their stares, could imagine the conversations that would dominate the morning. What game was the king playing? Why elevate a broken Omega? What did he see that they had missed? The forest swallowed them quickly, trees closing overhead to create a canopy of interlaced branches. Morning light filtered through in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes and spiderwebs strung with dew. The air smelled of pine and rich earth, of growing things, and the slow decay that fed new life. Sera felt something in her chest loosen, a tightness she hadn't realized was there until it began to ease. The forest had been forbidden to her for so long, a reminder of everything she'd lost. But now, riding beside a king through the green shadows, she remembered why she'd loved it. The peace here, the sense of connection to something larger and older than pack politics and social hierarchies. They rode in silence for perhaps 20 minutes, following a path that wound deeper into the territory. King Theron seemed to know exactly where he was going, though Sera was certain no one had given him directions. He navigated by instinct or memory, reading signs in the landscape that she couldn't interpret. Finally, he drew his horse to a halt in a small clearing where sunlight pooled on moss-covered stones. "Your grandmother came here," he said, often in the months before her death. "Do you remember this place?" Sera dismounted, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Memory stirred, hazy and uncertain. She had been here as a child, she thought. A long time ago, when Liana had still been teaching her the old ways. "I think so," she said slowly, "but I was very young, maybe 6 or 7 years old." King Theron dismounted as well, securing both horses to a low branch. "Walk with me. There's something you need to see before we go further." He led her to what appeared to be an ancient stone foundation, half buried beneath centuries of moss and fallen leaves. Only when Sera looked closely could she make out the deliberate pattern of the stones, the way they formed a perfect circle roughly 20 feet in diameter. "This was a healing circle," King Theron said, "built in the old times, when wolves understood that power came from connection rather than domination. Your grandmother maintained it, kept the knowledge alive even when others forgot." He knelt beside one of the stones, brushing away debris to reveal carved symbols weathered by time but still visible. "These marks are in the old tongue. They speak of balance, of the bond between wolves and the land they inhabit." Sera knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the carved lines. The stone was warm beneath her touch, warmer than sun-heated rock should be. And as her hand moved across the symbols, she felt that presence within her stir again, stronger now, more insistent. "What is this?" she whispered. "What am I feeling?" "Recognition." King Theron's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "The stones remember when power flowed freely here. They remember healers who could mend not just bodies but the land itself, and they recognize in you what your pack has failed to see." He stood, offering his hand to help her rise. "Come, we're close now. What I need to show you lies just beyond that ridge." They remounted and continued deeper into the forest, the trees growing larger and more ancient with each passing minute. These were old-growth survivors, giants that had stood since before the Great War, their roots running deep into earth that held memories of a different age. The path became less defined, barely more than a game trail winding between massive trunks. Sera's enhanced senses, sharpened by proximity to this place, or perhaps by King Theron's presence, caught details she would have missed before. The way birds fell silent as they approached certain areas, the subtle shift in air pressure that spoke of hidden spaces, the feeling of being watched by something neither hostile nor welcoming, simply observant. Finally, King Theron stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall of intertwined branches and hanging vines. But when he dismounted and approached, the vegetation seemed to part for him, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a person to pass through. "Leave the horses," he said. "They can't follow where we're going." Sera dismounted, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. King Theron produced a small lantern from his saddlebag, though no flame burned within it. Instead, when he spoke a single word in a language Sera didn't recognize, the lantern began to glow with soft white light. He caught her expression and almost smiled. Some things from the old times still work, if you know how to ask properly. The passage beyond the vegetation led downward, a natural tunnel formed by massive tree roots that had grown together over centuries. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying scents of stone and water and something else, something that made Sera's skin prickle with awareness. "Where are we going?" Her voice echoed strangely in the confined space. "To the heart of your territory, the place your pack has forgotten, or perhaps deliberately tried to erase from memory." The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast underground chamber. King Theron's lantern light seemed to expand, illuminating a space that took Sera's breath away. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows far overhead. But what drew her eye were the walls, covered entirely in luminous lichen that glowed with soft blue-green light. The effect was like standing inside a living jewel, light reflecting and refracting from 1,000 points, until the whole chamber seemed to pulse with gentle illumination. In the center of the space stood a stone circle similar to the one above, but larger and more elaborate. Symbols covered every surface, carved with such precision and artistry that they seemed to move in the shifting light. And at the very center rose a pillar of white stone, tall as 3 men, its surface polished smooth by centuries of touch. "This is the Heart Vault," King Theron said quietly. "Built by the first Lumina Council nearly 1,000 years ago. This was their sacred space, where they performed the great binding that connected wolves to the land, that made us guardians rather than conquerors." Sera moved forward as if in a dream, drawn by something she couldn't name. The symbols on the walls seemed to call to her, whispered in voices just below the threshold of hearing. Her fingers itched to touch them, to trace their patterns and unlock their meaning. "What happened here?" she asked. "Why was it sealed?" "Alpha Garrett's mining operation broke through to this chamber 6 months ago. His workers found it by accident, digging for the copper deposits that run through the eastern ridge." King Theron's expression was grim. "They reported feeling ill immediately. 2 died within days. The others showed symptoms of corruption, as if they'd been exposed to something toxic." Sera remembered the stories, whispered among the servants. Workers falling mysteriously sick. Garrett ordering the excavation sealed, declaring the area cursed. "But it's not cursed, is it?" she said slowly. "It's grieving." King Theron completed her thought. "The land is grieving. When the Lumina died or were killed, the binding they'd created weakened. The land has been waiting for centuries for someone to answer its call, to renew the connection that once sustained both wolves and wilderness." He turned to face her fully, his expression intent. "Your grandmother knew this. She found this chamber before the miners did. She spent days here, studying the symbols, researching in her journals, trying to understand what was needed. And then she went home and died 3 days later." The implication hit Sera like a physical blow. "You think she was murdered because she discovered this place?" King Theron's silence was answer enough. Sera's legs suddenly felt weak. She sank to her knees on the stone floor, her mind reeling. Everything she'd believed about Lyanna's death, about her own nature, about her place in the pack's hierarchy, was built on foundations of lies and deliberate ignorance. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would anyone kill her? Why hide this?" "Because knowledge is power, and power in the wrong hands threatens those who rule through fear." King Theron knelt beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "If your pack understood that the land itself was alive, that it responded to those who treated it with respect, that power could flow from partnership rather than domination, what would happen to alphas who built their authority on strength and intimidation?" Sera looked up at him, seeing understanding dawn. They would lose control. If wolves remembered they were meant to be guardians, to work with the land instead of exploiting it, everything would change. He nodded slowly. "And some would rather see the world die than lose their power over it." She turned her attention to the white stone pillar at the chamber's center, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. She stood and moved toward it, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. King Theron didn't try to stop her. Instead, he followed at a distance, watching intently. Sera stopped before the pillar, close enough to touch, but not yet making contact. The stone seemed to hum with contained energy, a vibration she felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. Symbols covered its surface, spiraling from base to summit in an intricate pattern that hurt to look at directly. "This is the Heartstone," King Theron said from behind her, "the anchor point for the original binding. Lumina would place their hands here and channel their power into the land, creating a network of protection and healing that spanned entire territories." "What happens if I touch it?" Sera's hand hovered inches from the stone, trembling. "I don't know for certain." His honesty was somehow reassuring. "But I suspect it will recognize what you are, and once that recognition occurs, there will be no going back. The pack won't be able to ignore you anymore. Neither will those who would prefer you remain ignorant of your true nature." Sera thought of her grandmother, of Lyanna's final words that had seemed like delirium, but might have been desperate warning. She thought of 3 years spent believing herself broken, diminished, less than the lowest omega. She thought of Ravens's casual cruelty and Garrett's dismissive contempt and all the ways she'd been made to feel that her very existence was burden and shame. And then she thought of the dying forest above, of land that had been waiting centuries for someone to hear its grief, of a heritage deliberately erased because it threatened those who preferred domination to partnership. Her hand moved forward and pressed against the white stone. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged up her arm like lightning, but instead of pain, it brought a sensation of coming home, of finding something lost that she hadn't known she was missing. Golden light exploded from the point of contact, spreading across the stone's surface in branching patterns that followed the carved symbols. Sera gasped as images flooded her mind, not her own memories, but something older and larger. She saw this chamber as it had been centuries ago, filled with wolves in flowing robes, their hands linked as they channeled power into the Heartstone. She felt their purpose, their dedication, their absolute certainty that what they did was right and necessary. She saw the binding they created, a web of golden light that spread from this chamber throughout the entire territory and beyond, connecting wolves to land, to sky, to water, in an intricate dance of mutual sustenance. Where the binding was strong, forests grew thick and healthy. Rivers ran clear. Prey animals thrived in numbers that sustained predator populations without endangering their own survival. And she saw what happened when the binding broke. When fear and ambition turned wolves against their own Lumina, when knowledge was suppressed and healers were hunted and the old ways were declared dangerous superstition. The golden web frayed and tore. The land began to sicken. Balance tilted toward exploitation and away from partnership. The vision released her suddenly, and she staggered backward. King Theron caught her before she could fall, his arms steady around her shoulders. "Breathe," he commanded quietly. "Just breathe. The first connection is always the most intense." Sera gulped air, her heart racing. The golden light still pulsed from the Heartstone, brighter now, and she could see answering glimmers in the symbols carved throughout the chamber walls. The lichen's blue-green glow seemed to intensify, and the air itself felt charged with possibility. "What did I just see?" she managed to ask. "Memory. The stone remembers everything that happened here. It showed you the truth your pack has forgotten." King Theron's voice was gentle but firm. "You are Lumina, Sera Ashwood. You are one of the Lightbringers, the healers who bound themselves to the land as guardians. Your wolf doesn't need to manifest physically because your power works differently. You connect to the living world itself." Sera pulled away from his support, needing to stand on her own as she processed this revelation. She looked at her hands, half expecting to see them glowing, but they appeared normal. Yet she could feel the difference in herself. That dormant presence that had stirred when King Theron first looked at her had fully awakened now, and she understood it wasn't a separate entity, but part of her own essential nature. "My grandmother knew," she said slowly. "She was training me all those years, not just teaching me healing arts, but preparing me for this." "Yes, but she ran out of time." King Theron moved to stand beside her, both of them facing the glowing Heartstone. "Whatever she discovered in this chamber frightened her enough that she tried to accelerate your awakening. The pendant she gave you wasn't just a keepsake. It was a focus, meant to help you channel power you didn't yet understand. And someone killed her to prevent her from completing my training." Anger kindled in Sera's chest, hot and righteous. "Someone in my own pack murdered my grandmother because she tried to preserve knowledge that threatened their authority. King Theron's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes blazed with their own cold fury. "That is my suspicion, and until we know who, you remain in danger. The same forces that eliminated Lyanna will come for you once they realize what you've become. Then we need to find out who before they can move against me." Sera turned to face him fully, decision crystallizing. "You said the land is dying because the binding broke. Can it be renewed?" "In theory, yes, but it would require a Lumina willing to attempt the ritual, and an Alpha willing to stand as witness and anchor. The binding doesn't just connect Wolf to land, it connects the Lumina to their partner, sharing power and life force. Once formed, the bond is permanent." King Theron held her gaze steadily. "It's not a decision to make lightly. But it could heal the territory, save the forest, restore balance. Over time, yes. The binding would have to be maintained, nurtured like any living thing. It's not instant magic, but gradual transformation." Sera's mind raced through implications and possibilities. If she could prove that Lumina power wasn't dangerous but healing, that the old ways offered solutions to problems the pack faced, perhaps she could change minds. Perhaps she could honor her grandmother's legacy and protect future wolves from the ignorance that had caused so much suffering. "I want to try," she said firmly. "Teach me what I need to know." Something that might have been respect flickered across King Theron's face. "You would bind yourself to this territory? Accept responsibility for its healing even though the pack has treated you with contempt? They're still my people. This is still my home. And someone needs to remember what we've forgotten, even if it costs me everything." King Theron studied her for a long moment, those winter-blue eyes searching for doubt or hesitation. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Very well. But not here, not now. This chamber holds too many secrets to rush. We'll take what we've learned back to the surface, and tonight we'll discuss what the binding requires." His expression grew stern. "And Sera, understand this. The ritual requires absolute truth between participants. No secrets, no deceptions, no hidden shame. If you attempt it while concealing part of yourself, the backlash could destroy you both." The warning sent a chill down her spine, but she nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I've lived 90 years, girl. I've done things that would make lesser wolves break. If we attempt this binding, you'll feel every shadow I carry." His voice dropped lower. "And I'll feel yours. There's no privacy in a Lumina bond. No walls between souls. Then we'll know each other truly." Sera kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Isn't that what partnership requires?" Before King Theron could respond, a sound echoed from the tunnel entrance. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching fast. Both of them tensed immediately, King Theron's hand moving to the knife at his belt, while Sera's newly awakened senses strained to identify the intruders. Raven's Blackwood emerged from the tunnel first, flanked by 2 other beta wolves. His expression was a mixture of triumph and malice as he took in the scene before him. The glowing heartstone, the luminous chamber, Sera standing at its center with power still crackling faintly around her. "So it's true," Raven said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The broken Omega is a witch after all, practicing forbidden magic, corrupting our sacred places with her unnatural power." King Theron stepped forward, placing himself between Ravens and Sera. "You followed us against my explicit orders. That alone justifies severe punishment." Raven's confidence faltered slightly, but anger drove him forward. "The pack has a right to know what you've been doing, Your Majesty, what she is." He pointed at Sera with barely controlled fury. "We felt it. Everyone in the territory felt it. That surge of power, that wrongness. She's dangerous, an abomination that needs to be controlled before she destroys us all." The 2 betas with Ravens shifted uncomfortably, clearly less certain than their leader. But they stood their ground, loyalty or fear keeping them in place. "What you felt," King Theron said with dangerous calm, "was the land responding to its rightful guardian. What you call wrongness is your own ignorance recoiling from truth." He took a step forward, and even from behind him Sera could feel the weight of his authority pressing down. "Now you have a choice, Beta Ravens. You can swear an oath of silence about what you've witnessed here, or you can face my judgment for insubordination and trespass. Choose quickly." Raven's face went pale, then flushed dark with rage and impotent fury. His wolf was close to the surface. Sera could see it in the way his eyes flickered between human and animal. But he wasn't fool enough to challenge an Alpha King directly. "I'll take the oath," he ground out through clenched teeth. King Theron gestured to the Heartstone. Then approach and swear it, here, before the oldest witness in this territory. The ritual was brief, but binding. Ravens placed his palm against the Heartstone, which pulsed once with golden light. He spoke the words King Theron dictated, promising silence about everything seen and heard in this chamber. When he finished, the stone flared brighter, and Ravens jerked his hand away as if burned. "It is done," King Theron said. "The stone has witnessed your oath. Break it, and your wolf will abandon you, your strength will desert you, and your place in the pack will be forfeit. Now go." Ravens fled, his companions following close behind. Their footsteps echoed down the tunnel until silence returned. "He'll find a way around the oath," Sera said quietly, "or he'll make my life hell in ways that don't technically violate his promise." "Undoubtedly." King Theron turned to face her, his expression serious. "Which is why we don't have the luxury of slow preparation. The pack knows something happened today. They felt your awakening. We need to move quickly before fear hardens into hostility. What do you suggest?" "We return to the Packlands. Tonight I'll speak with Alpha Garrett privately, explain what you are and what the binding ritual requires. If he agrees to allow it, we attempt the renewal tomorrow at dawn." King Theron's gaze held hers steadily. "And if he refuses, you leave with me immediately. I won't allow you to remain where your life is in danger." The thought of leaving the only home she'd known was terrifying, but so was the alternative of staying among wolves who feared what they couldn't understand. "Let's hope he agrees then," Sera said. They made their way back through the tunnel, collected their horses, and rode toward the Packlands in heavy silence. The morning's revelations weighed on them both, transforming what had begun as investigation into something far more complex and dangerous. As they emerged from the deep forest, Sera could feel the difference in herself. Her senses remained heightened, attuned to the land in ways that felt both strange and utterly natural. She could sense the health of individual trees, could feel where water flowed beneath the ground, could detect the presence of animals long before seeing or hearing them. And she could feel the sickness in the land, the corruption that had spread from the broken binding like infection from an untreated wound. It manifested as a wrongness in the air, a subtle discord in what should have been harmonious. The forest was dying, slowly but inexorably, and only restoring the ancient connection could save it. They reached the meeting point where the hunt party had assembled for a midday meal. Alpha Garrett sat on a fallen log, drinking from a flask, while various pack members clustered in small groups sharing food and recounting their morning's pursuits. Conversation died as King Theron and Sera rode into the clearing, every eye turned toward them, measuring and assessing. Sera held her head high, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. Garrett stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty, I trust your morning was productive?" "Very much so." King Theron dismounted with fluid grace. "In fact, Alpha Garrett, I need to speak with you privately. There are matters of significant importance that require your immediate attention." Something in his tone made Garrett's eyes narrow with suspicion, but protocol demanded cooperation with visiting royalty, especially royalty as powerful as the Northern King. "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall we return to my study?" "That would be appropriate." King Theron glanced at Sera. "Return to your quarters. Rest. We'll speak again this evening." It was dismissal, but gentle, acknowledging her exhaustion without diminishing her importance. Sera nodded and dismounted, leading Ember toward the stables. As she walked through the Packlands, she felt the weight of stairs following her movement. Whispers started before she was out of earshot. "Did you feel it this morning? That pulse of power?" It came from her direction. "But that's impossible. She's broken. Maybe that's what we were told. Maybe there's more to her than we knew. Or maybe she's exactly what Raven said, dangerous, unnatural, something that needs to be controlled before it's too late." Sera kept walking, her jaw set, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. Let them whisper. Let them fear. She knew the truth now. She understood what her grandmother had tried to protect, what she herself was meant to become. And tomorrow, if Alpha Garrett allowed it, she would prove that being different wasn't the same as being broken, that the old ways weren't dangerous but desperately needed, that power could heal as well as harm if wolves were brave enough to remember what they'd forgotten. The sun was setting by the time King Theron summoned her to Alpha Garrett's private study. She'd spent the afternoon in her small room, trying to rest, but finding sleep impossible. Her mind kept returning to the heart vault, to the visions the stone had shown her, to the magnitude of what she was being asked to attempt. Garrett's study was a large room lined with shelves of books and maps, dominated by a heavy wooden desk scarred with decades of use. The Alpha himself sat behind the desk, his expression closed and careful. King Theron stood by the window, silhouetted against the dying light. Sera entered and stood before the desk, uncertain of her place in this meeting. "Sit," Garrett said, gesturing to one of the chairs facing him. His tone was neither warm nor cold, simply neutral. "King Theron has explained certain things about what you are, what you might be capable of doing." Sera sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She waited for him to continue. Garrett's jaw worked as if the next words tasted bitter. "I've been blind, worse than blind, willfully ignorant. The mining operation that broke into those caverns 6 months ago, the sickness that followed, the deterioration of our territory's health. I thought it was coincidence, bad luck. But according to His Majesty, it's consequence." He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out what appeared to be a journal bound in leather. "This belonged to my grandfather. He survived the Great War, rebuilt this pack from almost nothing. He wrote about the old times, about Lumina and the binding rituals, about how wolves used to live in partnership with the land." Garrett opened the journal to a marked page, his finger tracing lines of faded script. "I never believed him. Thought it was old man's nostalgia, romanticizing a past that never existed. But His Majesty showed me proof, explained things that my grandfather wrote about but I dismissed." He looked up at Sera, and for the first time she saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. "Is it true? Can you really heal what's been broken?" "I don't know," Sera answered honestly. "I've only just discovered what I am, but I want to try." "The land is dying, Alpha Garrett. I can feel it now. And if there's any chance the old binding can save it, we have to take that chance." King Theron spoke from his position by the window. "The ritual requires an Alpha to stand as witness and anchor. Traditionally, this would be the Alpha of the territory being healed. But the commitment is substantial. Once the binding is formed, you cannot simply walk away from it. You become responsible for maintaining the partnership, for defending the Lumina who serves as guardian." Garrett's hands clenched on the journal. "And if I refuse? Then Sera leaves with me tonight, and your territory continues its decline until there's nothing left to save." King Theron's voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment or threat. "The choice is yours, Alpha Garrett. Fear and tradition, or trust and transformation." The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Sera watched emotions play across Garrett's face. Pride, resistance, doubt, and finally something that might have been hope. "How long will it take," he asked finally, "to heal the territory?" "Years," King Theron said bluntly. "The binding isn't instant magic, it's a framework for gradual restoration, but the alternative is continued decay and eventual collapse." Garrett closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with decision written in their depths. "Very well, we attempt the ritual. Tomorrow at dawn." He looked at Sera directly for the first time since she'd entered. "And Sera, if you can truly do what His Majesty claims, then I owe you an apology I can never adequately give." The acknowledgement, unexpected and raw, brought tears to Sera's eyes. She blinked them back and nodded, not trusting her voice. But Garrett wasn't finished. "However," he continued, his voice hardening, "if you fail, if this proves to be deception or danger to my pack, I will end you myself. Royal protection or not, my first duty is to the wolves under my care." "Understood," Sera said quietly. King Theron moved away from the window, his expression approving. "Then we have an agreement. Sera, you should rest tonight. Tomorrow will demand everything you have. Alpha Garrett, I'll need access to your grandfather's journals. They may contain details about the ritual that have been lost elsewhere." "Take whatever you need," Garrett said, gesturing to the shelves. "I'll have the library open for you." After Sera was dismissed, she made her way back through halls that felt different now. Pack members she passed didn't quite meet her eyes, but nor did they sneer or mock. Uncertainty had replaced contempt, and while it wasn't acceptance, it was something closer to respect. Mira found her before she reached her room, pulling her into a quiet alcove away from passing traffic. "What happened today?" Mira's voice was urgent, worried. "Everyone's talking about some kind of power surge. Ravens came back from the forest looking like he'd seen a ghost. And now there are rumors that you and the king—" "I can't explain everything," Sera interrupted gently. "Not yet. But tomorrow something important happens. something that might change things for all of us. Mira studied her face, searching for clues. You're different. The way you hold yourself, the way you speak. It's like you've been replaced by someone who just looks like you. Sera smiled despite her exhaustion. I'm still me. I'm just more me than I've been allowed to be for a long time. Her friend pulled her into a fierce embrace. Be careful, whatever you're doing. The pack is scared, and scared wolves do stupid things. I know, Sera returned the hug, but some things are worth the risk. She spent the evening in her room, unable to eat the food Mira brought her, unable to focus on anything beyond tomorrow's ritual. King Theron had warned her about the binding's demands. Absolute truth. No secrets, no walls between souls, which meant she would have to face things about herself she'd kept buried. The resentment toward her grandmother for dying and leaving her alone, the anger at the pack for their cruelty, the deep, aching loneliness of 3 years spent believing she was fundamentally broken. And King Theron would feel all of it, would see every weakness, every shame, every moment of despair she'd hidden behind careful neutrality. The thought terrified her, but beneath the terror ran a thread of something else. Relief, perhaps. The exhaustion of pretending was a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its burden. To be truly known, completely seen, might be devastating, but it might also be freedom. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find King Theron standing in the corridor, his expression serious. May I come in? It's important. Sera stepped back, allowing him entry into her small room. He seemed to fill the space, his presence somehow larger than his physical form. Tomorrow is not a ceremony to undertake unprepared. He got straight to the point, as always. The binding requires us to share our deepest truths, our greatest shames. I need you to understand what you're accepting when you agree to be bound to me. He moved to her window, staring out at the darkening forest. I'm 90 years old, Sera. I've lived long enough to make more mistakes than most wolves see in a lifetime. I've sent soldiers to die in wars I now question. I've made decisions for political necessity that haunt me. I carry the weight of centuries of bloodshed and compromise. His voice dropped lower. 20 years ago, I led a campaign against rogues threatening our borders. Bad intelligence led us into an ambush. 300 wolves died under my command. I survived. They didn't. I remember every name, every face, and when you bind yourself to me, you'll carry that weight too. Sera moved to stand beside him at the window. We all carry shadows, Your Majesty. Mine might be smaller because I've lived fewer years, but they're no less painful. Tell me one. His eyes met hers, intent. If we're to do this, start the honesty now. She took a breath, gathering courage. I resented my grandmother for dying, for leaving me alone when I needed her most. Part of me was angry that she hid what I was, instead of teaching me to defend myself. And I feel guilty for that anger, because she was trying to protect me, and I'm too selfish to appreciate the sacrifice. The confession hung between them, raw and uncomfortable, but King Theron nodded slowly, acceptance in his expression. That's honest. That's real. He turned from the window. Tomorrow, when we perform the binding, there will be more, deeper, darker, things neither of us wants to face. Are you prepared for that? No, Sera admitted, but I'll do it anyway. Something that might have been a smile touched his lips. Then you're braver than most. Rest now. Dawn comes early, and what we attempt will change both our lives forever. After he left, Sera lay on her bed and watched moonlight paint patterns on her ceiling. Tomorrow she would attempt something that hadn't been done in centuries. She would open herself completely to a man she barely knew. She would risk everything on the hope that ancient knowledge might heal modern wounds. And if she failed, she would likely die. But if she succeeded, she might finally become what her grandmother had always known she could be. A Lumina, a light bringer, a guardian of the balance between wolves and the world they inhabited. Sleep finally claimed her in the hours before dawn, and her dreams were filled with golden light and the whisper of trees that remembered when the world was young. The night had been endless, filled with dreams of golden light and voices speaking languages she couldn't understand, but somehow comprehended. When Sera finally opened her eyes, the sky beyond her window showed no trace of coming dawn, only stars, cold and distant, watching as she prepared for what might be her last sunrise. She'd laid out the riding clothes before attempting sleep, unable to bear the thought of fumbling with unfamiliar garments in the dark. Now she dressed by candlelight, her movements mechanical, each buckle and lace a small act of defiance against the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The leather breeches felt like armor, the fitted jacket like a warrior's second skin. She was going into battle today, though the enemy was centuries of broken promises and forgotten knowledge. Her grandmother's pendant lay on the small table beside her bed. Sera picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, but this time something was different. The wooden wolf seemed to pulse with faint warmth, as if Liana's spirit recognized the significance of this moment. Or perhaps it was simply Sera's awakened power responding to her emotional state, the boundary between imagination and reality growing thin. She fastened the leather cord around her neck and whispered to the empty room, "If I fail today, at least I tried. That's more than fear ever accomplished." Outside her window, the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. Time to face what came next. A knock at her door announced King Theron's arrival. He entered at her invitation, already dressed for the ritual in simple clothing that somehow made him appear more regal than any ceremonial finery could achieve. His dark hair was unbound, falling past his shoulders, and his winter-blue eyes carried the weight of sleepless contemplation. "Are you ready?" His voice was quiet, respectful of the early hour and the magnitude of what they faced. "I don't think anyone could be truly ready for this." Sera met his gaze steadily. "But I'm willing. That will have to be enough." Willingness is more important than readiness. He stepped closer, and she caught his scent, pine and snow and something wild that made her newly awakened power respond with recognition. The ritual we're about to perform hasn't been done in over a century. There's no guarantee it will work, no promise that we'll survive the attempt. "I know." She kept her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "But the alternative is watching the land die and knowing I could have tried to save it." King Theron studied her face for a long moment, searching for doubt or hesitation. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Then let's begin. Alpha Garrett is already waiting at the Heart Vault with witnesses he trusts. We go now, before the pack fully wakes and fear has time to harden into opposition." They moved through the silent corridors of the pack house, their footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. Outside, the world held its breath between darkness and light, that liminal time when possibilities seemed infinite and the boundary between what was and what might be grew thin. Horses waited in the courtyard, held by a stable hand who kept his eyes carefully lowered. The same mounts from yesterday, Ember and the Black Stallion, already saddled and prepared. Someone had been busy while the pack slept, making arrangements with efficiency that spoke of military precision. They rode into the forest as the first rays of sun broke through the trees, painting everything in golden light that seemed almost symbolic. The path felt different now to Sera, not threatening or forbidden, but familiar. Her connection to the land, awakened by touching the Heartstone, allowed her to sense the forest's presence in ways she'd never imagined possible. She could feel where deer bedded down for the night, could sense the slow movement of sap in ancient trees, could detect the underground flow of water seeking its path to lower ground. The forest was alive in ways that had nothing to do with individual creatures, and everything to do with the vast, interconnected system that sustained all life within its boundaries. And she could feel the sickness, too, more clearly now than yesterday. It manifested as discord in the symphony, notes that jarred and clashed where harmony should reign. The mining operation had torn open something that should have remained sealed, and the wound festered, spreading corruption through channels that connected everything to everything else. "We're running out of time," she said quietly as they rode. "The damage is accelerating. I can feel it spreading." King Theron glanced at her, his expression grave. "How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe. Months if we're lucky. But not years. The binding protected this land for centuries. Without it, the accumulated damage of decades is catching up all at once. Then we succeed today or accept that this territory is lost." The finality of his words settled over them like a shroud. They rode the rest of the way in heavy silence. Alpha Garrett waited at the entrance to the underground chamber, flanked by 2 wolves Sera recognized as his most trusted council members. Not ravens, she noted with relief. Garrett had chosen witnesses who could be relied upon for discretion and support, rather than those driven by fear or ambition. "Your Majesty." Garrett inclined his head respectfully to King Theron, then turned to Sera with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The chamber is prepared. I've studied my grandfather's journals through the night. I understand what's required of me. And you accept those requirements? King Theron's voice carried the weight of formal inquiry. You understand that this binding is permanent, that you're accepting responsibility not just for today, but for years to come. I understand. Garrett's jaw was set with determination. My grandfather wrote that the greatest leaders are those who serve rather than command. Perhaps it's time I learned what that truly means. They descended into the earth, the passage seeming longer and more oppressive than Sera remembered. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of what awaited them at the tunnel's end. The glowing lichen provided illumination, but shadows seemed deeper today, as if the chamber itself recognized the significance of what was about to occur. The heart vault opened before them, vast and ancient. The white stone pillar at its center no longer glowed, having returned to dormancy after yesterday's awakening. But Sera could feel its potential, the power coiled within like a spring compressed and waiting for release. Garrett's council members took positions at the chamber's edge, far enough away to give privacy, but close enough to bear witness. Their faces showed mixture of fear and fascination, wolves confronting knowledge their generation had been taught to dismiss as superstition. King Theron moved to the stone circle surrounding the central pillar, studying the symbols carved into the floor. His fingers traced patterns that Sera's newly attuned senses recognized as anchoring points, places where power would flow and concentrate during the ritual. The binding requires 3 phases, he said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of instruction. First, the Lumina must open herself to the land, establishing connection with the earth and all it sustains. Second, the Alpha must offer himself as anchor and witness, accepting responsibility for protection and partnership. Third, we join our purposes, binding our intentions together and channeling that combined will into the renewal of the ancient compact. He looked up at both Garrett and Sera, his expression grave. Any deception during these phases will cause catastrophic backlash. The ritual demands absolute truth. If you harbor doubts, speak them now. If you carry secrets you're unwilling to share, this is your last chance to withdraw. Garrett shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. I have doubts. I'd be a fool not to, but I'm committed to seeing this through. And you, Lumina? King Theron's winter blue eyes found Sera's. Are you prepared to open yourself completely? To be known and witnessed without walls or pretense? Sera thought of 3 years spent believing herself broken, of the weight of shame she'd carried like chains, of her grandmother's death and the unanswered questions that had haunted her nights, of every moment of humiliation and dismissal she'd endured from wolves who should have protected her. All of it would come flooding out during the ritual. Every wound, every weakness, every secret fear. King Theron would feel it all, and through him, so would Alpha Garrett and anyone else connected to the binding. The thought was terrifying. It was also liberating. I'm ready, she said simply. King Theron nodded once, accepting her word. Then we begin. He gestured for Sera to approach the Heartstone. She moved forward, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber, and placed both palms against the white stone pillar. The surface was cool beneath her hands, smooth as glass, humming with contained energy that responded immediately to her touch. Golden light bloomed where flesh met stone, spreading in branching patterns that followed the carved symbols, spiraling up the pillar's height. But unlike yesterday's explosive awakening, this time the power built gradually, giving her time to adjust, to breathe, to center herself. Open yourself to the land, King Theron instructed, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Feel the connections that bind all living things. Let go of the boundaries between self and other. Become part of the greater whole. Sera closed her eyes and did as instructed, dropping the mental barriers that kept her separate and distinct. It felt like stepping off a cliff into vast emptiness, a moment of pure terror followed by the discovery that she could fly. Her awareness expanded outward from the Heartstone, following channels carved by centuries of use. She felt the forest above, every tree and bush and blade of grass connected through root systems and fungal networks that created an underground web of communication. She felt the animals that called this place home, from the largest predator to the smallest insect, each one playing its part in the greater symphony. And she felt the wolves, her pack, sleeping in their homes or beginning to stir with the dawn. She felt their fears and hopes, their loves and hatreds, the complex tangle of relationships that bound them together into something greater than the sum of individual lives. The sensation was overwhelming, too much information flooding in too fast. She gasped, nearly pulling away, but King Theron's voice anchored her. "Don't fight it. Let it flow through you. You're not trying to control or command. You're simply bearing witness, acknowledging what already exists." She steadied herself and stopped resisting. The flood of sensation didn't diminish, but she learned to let it pass through her rather than trying to hold on to every detail. She became a conduit rather than a container, allowing the land's awareness to move through her without being overwhelmed by its magnitude. And as she opened herself to the land opened itself to her. She felt its pain, the wounds that had accumulated over decades of exploitation without partnership. She felt its loneliness, centuries of waiting for guardians who never returned. She felt its hope, fragile but real, that perhaps this time the connection would hold. "Good," King Theron said quietly. "You've established the first link. Now comes the harder part. You must face what you've buried. The ritual demands honesty, and you cannot lie to yourself." Images began to surface from her memory, pulled forth by the ritual's requirements. She saw herself at 10 years old, working alongside her grandmother, learning the properties of herbs and the setting of bones. She felt the joy of those days, the sense of purpose and belonging that came from useful work. Then she saw her claiming ceremony, standing in the sacred circle while other young wolves transformed around her. She felt again the desperate hope that her wolf would emerge, the crushing disappointment when nothing happened, the shame that followed like a shadow. But beneath the shame lay anger, hot and righteous and never fully acknowledged, anger at a pack that judged her broken without understanding, anger at a system that measured worth by power and dismissed those who didn't fit narrow definitions, anger at her grandmother for hiding the truth, for dying before explaining, for leaving her alone and defenseless. The anger rose now, dragged into the light by the ritual's demands. She'd spent 3 years suppressing it, pretending it didn't exist, because angry Omegas didn't survive. But here, connected to the Heartstone with power flowing through her, she couldn't hide anymore. "I was so angry," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. "Angry at everyone, at the pack for their cruelty, at my grandmother for her secrets, at myself for being different. I carried that anger like poison, letting it eat away at me because I had nowhere to put it." The confession echoed in the chamber, raw and painful. But as the words left her, she felt something shift inside. The anger didn't disappear, but acknowledging it somehow made it less toxic. It became simply another part of her experience, neither good nor bad, just true. King Theron's voice was gentle when he spoke. "Anger at injustice is not sin. It's wisdom. The wrong lies in what was done to you, not in your response to that wrong." More memories surfaced. Her grandmother's final hours, the desperate whispered warnings that Sera had dismissed as delirium, the funeral, standing alone while pack members who'd benefited from Lyanna's healing for decades barely paused to acknowledge her passing. The long nights afterward, crying silently in her small room, terrified of the future and mourning a past she could never reclaim. And beneath all of it, the deepest fear she'd never voiced, that perhaps the pack was right, perhaps she was broken, perhaps her grandmother's faith had been misplaced, and she truly was defective, damaged, unworthy of the love and hope that had been invested in her. That fear had lived in her heart for 3 years, a constant whisper undermining every moment of tentative confidence. But now, connected to the land through the Heartstone, feeling the vast web of life that recognized and welcomed her, she understood the truth. She wasn't broken. She never had been. She was simply something the pack had forgotten how to recognize. The revelation brought tears that streamed down her face unchecked. She wept for the girl who'd believed she was defective. She wept for 3 years of unnecessary suffering. She wept for her grandmother, who'd tried so hard to protect her and paid the ultimate price. And as she wept, the golden light from the Heartstone intensified, responding to her emotional release. The stone itself seemed to vibrate with sympathetic resonance, acknowledging her pain and offering its own form of comfort. "You've completed the first phase," King Theron said quietly. "You've opened yourself to the land and faced your own truths. Now we proceed to the second phase." He stepped forward into the stone circle, positioning himself opposite Sera with the heartstone pillar between them. He placed his own hands on the stone, and silver light joined the gold, the two colors intertwining like threads being woven together. "I stand as Alpha and Witness," he said formally, his voice resonating with authority that seemed to fill the entire chamber. "I offer myself as anchor and protector. I accept responsibility for the guardian who binds herself to this land. I pledge my strength to support her purpose, my wisdom to guide her choices, my life to defend her person." The words were traditional, drawn from rituals older than the Great War, but King Theron infused them with personal meaning, making them more than empty formula. "And I acknowledge my own failures," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "I've lived 90 years and made mistakes that haunt me still. I've chosen expediency over honor. I've sacrificed individuals for what I deemed the greater good. I've carried the weight of command so long I'd forgotten what it meant to serve." Silver light pulsed brighter as he spoke, responding to his honesty. Sera felt his presence through the connection, not invading her awareness, but making himself available. She sensed the depth of experience he carried, the accumulated wisdom and regret of a long life spent navigating impossible choices. The memories came unbidden through their deepening bond, not words, but felt experience, decades compressed into moments of searing clarity. A young king signing execution orders with trembling hands, sacrificing a friend to preserve justice. Border negotiations where he'd chosen thousands of lives over hundreds, knowing both numbers represented real wolves with families who would grieve. The ambush 20 years past that he'd already shared with her, but now she felt its full weight, 300 names carved into his soul like scars that would never fade. But deeper still, she sensed his greatest fear, that leadership had hollowed him out, that necessity had burned away everything soft and human, leaving only cold calculation. That he'd become the very thing he'd once sworn to never be, a ruler who saw wolves as numbers on maps rather than lives worth protecting. The sharing was intimate beyond anything Sera had experienced, not just knowing about his pain, but carrying it with him, feeling how each loss had shaped him, how each compromise had cost pieces of himself he could never reclaim. And through it all, she felt his fierce determination that those sacrifices would mean something, that he would become better rather than let failure destroy him. "You honored them," she said softly, the words emerging without conscious thought, "by remembering, by changing, by refusing to let pride blind you again." King Theron's eyes met hers across the glowing pillar, and in them she saw surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. "And now," he said, his voice returning to ritual formality, "we proceed to the third and final phase, the joining of purposes, the binding of intentions, the renewal of the ancient compact between wolves and the land we inhabit." He extended one hand toward her, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. Sera lifted her own hand, hesitating for just a moment before placing her palm against his. The contact completed a circuit. Power surged through them both, gold and silver light exploding outward from the heartstone in waves that illuminated the entire chamber. The symbols carved into walls and floor blazed with sudden brilliance, forming patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. "Speak your intention!" King Theron commanded, his voice somehow audible despite the roar of energy surrounding them. Sera drew breath and let the words come from the deepest part of her being, the place where her true nature resided. "I bind myself to this land as guardian and healer. I pledge to honor the connections that sustain all life. I promise to remember what others have forgotten, to preserve what others would destroy, to stand as bridge between what was and what might be. I accept responsibility for the health of this territory and all who dwell within it. I will serve with wisdom, heal with compassion, and protect what cannot protect itself." As she spoke, golden light spiraled up from the heartstone, wrapping around her like a cocoon. She felt it sinking into her skin, into her bones, into the very core of her being. The land was accepting her pledge, binding itself to her just as she bound herself to it. "And I," King Theron said, his voice resonating with power, "accept responsibility as anchor and witness. I pledge my strength to support the guardian, my wisdom to guide the healing, my life to defend the balance. Where she serves, I protect. Where she builds, I defend. Where she heals, I ensure her safety. This I swear by stone and sky, by root and river, by every bond that connects living things to one another." Silver light rose to meet the gold, and where they intertwined, something new was born. Not gold or silver, but a luminous platinum that seemed to contain both colors and transcend them simultaneously. Alpha Garrett stepped forward then, moving to join them within the circle. He placed his hands on the heartstone as well, adding his presence to the ritual. "And I, as Alpha of the Eastern Pack, witness this binding." He spoke haltingly, reading from notes he'd transcribed from his grandfather's journal. "I acknowledge the guardian who serves my territory. I accept responsibility to honor her purpose and defend her person. I pledge that my pack will remember what has been forgotten, that we will partner rather than dominate, that we will preserve rather than exploit." The light intensified further, becoming almost unbearable. Sera felt as though she were being unmade and remade simultaneously, every molecule of her being vibrating at a frequency that was both agonizing and ecstatic. Through the overwhelming sensation, she felt King Theron's presence anchoring her, his strength lending her stability when she might otherwise have been swept away. And she felt the land responding, the vast network of connections that sustained the forest opening to accept her presence, welcoming her as guardian after centuries of abandonment. The ritual reached its crescendo. Light exploded outward in a shockwave that shook the entire chamber, sending stone dust raining from the ceiling and causing the witnesses at the chamber's edge to stumble backward. The heartstone blazed like a star, brilliant beyond bearing, and for one eternal moment, Sera couldn't tell where she ended and the world began. Then, like a wave crashing and receding, the power settled. The light dimmed to a gentle glow. The roar of energy faded to whisper, and Sera found herself still standing, still breathing, still herself, but fundamentally changed. She looked down at her hands and saw a faint tracery of golden light just beneath her skin, following the paths of veins and arteries. The marks faded even as she watched, sinking deeper into her flesh until they became invisible. But she could still feel them, feel the power flowing through channels that hadn't existed before. King Theron's hands showed similar marks in silver, already fading to invisibility. His winter blue eyes met hers, and in them she saw reflection of her own wonder and exhaustion. "It's done," he said simply. "The binding is complete." Alpha Garrett removed his hands from the heartstone slowly, as if the contact had become part of him, and separation required effort. His face showed shock and awe in equal measure. "I felt it," he whispered. "The land, the connections, everything my grandfather wrote about, everything I dismissed as fantasy, I felt it all." His eyes found Sera's, and in them was something she'd never expected to see directed at her. Respect. "We were wrong about you. I was wrong. I cannot apologize enough for what you've endured because of our ignorance." The acknowledgement meant more than Sera had words to express. She simply nodded, accepting it as the gift it was. But King Theron's expression remained serious despite the ritual's success. "The binding is established, but the healing has only begun. Sera will need time to learn her abilities, to understand the full scope of what she can do, and the pack will need time to accept this change." "How long," Garrett asked, "before we see results?" "Years," King Theron said bluntly. "Perhaps decades. This isn't instant magic. It's a framework for gradual restoration. But if you maintain the binding, honor the partnership, and resist the temptation to return to old patterns of exploitation, this territory will not only heal, but thrive." Garrett nodded slowly, accepting the timeline. "Then we begin the work. Today." They made their way back to the surface, emerging into morning sunlight that seemed brighter than when they'd descended. The forest around them already looked different to Sera, or perhaps she simply saw it more clearly. Every tree, every bird, every insect going about its business was part of the vast web she now felt connected to. And she could sense the work ahead, the corrupted areas that needed cleansing, the damaged systems that required repair, the careful, patient labor of restoration that would occupy years of her life. The magnitude of it should have been overwhelming, but instead she felt purpose settling over her shoulders like a mantle she'd been born to wear. The pack had gathered in the clearing near the chamber entrance, drawn by the surge of power they'd felt even from distance. Hundreds of faces turned toward them as they emerged, expressions ranging from fear to wonder to hostile suspicion. Ravens Blackwood stood near the front, his face twisted with barely contained fury. Behind him clustered those who shared his views, wolves who saw change as threat rather than opportunity. But there were others too, younger wolves whose eyes showed curiosity rather than fear, elders who'd lived long enough to question accepted wisdom, and common pack members who simply wanted their territory to stop dying, who were willing to try new solutions when old approaches had failed. Alpha Garrett stepped forward, positioning himself between the crowd and the ritual participants. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of Alpha command. Today we have witnessed something our generation believed impossible. The binding of a Lumina guardian to our land, a partnership that our ancestors relied upon and we foolishly abandoned. His gaze swept the assembled crowd, daring anyone to object. This is not a return to weakness, but a reclamation of strength. Not abandonment of tradition, but remembrance of older, wiser ways. Movement from the crowd. Beta Ravens pushed forward, his face dark with rage, barely held in check. "This is heresy," he snarled. "Forbidden magic that will doom us all. That girl is unnatural, dangerous, and you've given her power over all of us." His eyes found Sera, filled with hatred. She'll destroy the pack, just as her kind destroyed the old world. Sera felt King Theron tense beside her, felt his instinct to defend rising. But before he could speak, she stepped forward herself, meeting Raven's glare without flinching. "I'm not here to destroy anything," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the morning air. "I'm here to heal what's been broken, to remember what's been forgotten, to offer partnership instead of domination. You can accept that or not, Beta Ravens, but your fear doesn't change truth." For a moment she thought Ravens might attack, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing harsh and ragged. But he was not quite foolish enough to assault someone under royal protection and his alpha's defense. Instead, he spat at her feet and turned away, stalking toward the packlands with his supporters following. Perhaps a third of the assembled crowd went with him, wolves whose fear or prejudice ran too deep for reason to reach. But 2/3 remained. Not all of them looked convinced or comfortable, but they stayed. That would have to be enough. The days that followed established new rhythms. Sera spent mornings in the forest, learning to channel her power into healing the corrupted areas left by the mining operation. King Theron accompanied her, teaching techniques he'd learned from ancient texts and making himself available as anchor when her efforts threatened to overwhelm her still developing control. Alpha Garrett proved his commitment by ordering the mine permanently sealed and the excavated materials properly disposed of. Work crews labored under Sera's guidance to remove the worst of the contamination, hauling away poisoned stone and replacing it with clean earth. The physical work was slow and backbreaking, but necessary. Magic could heal, but mundane effort had to support that healing. The work was exhausting, more draining than any physical labor she'd ever performed, but it was also deeply satisfying. She could feel the land responding to her touch, slowly recovering health it had lost. Trees that had been dying put forth new growth. Streams that ran dark and poisoned gradually cleared. Animals that had fled began to return. And as the land healed, so did the pack. Not everyone, not quickly, but gradually. Wolves who'd dismissed her as broken Omega began to see her as something else. Some still feared what she represented, but others approached with careful respect, asking questions about the old ways, seeking to understand what had been lost and what might be reclaimed. Mira became her constant companion when duties allowed, helping where she could and simply providing friendship when help wasn't needed. Her presence reminded Sera that she wasn't alone, that she had allies even among those who'd witnessed her lowest moments. And Alpha Garrett proved surprisingly committed to honoring the binding. He opened his grandfather's library to Sera, giving her access to journals and texts that contained knowledge the pack had dismissed but never quite destroyed. He defended her before the council when traditionalists like Ravens argued for restriction of her activities. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to lead through service rather than domination. But it was King Theron whose presence shaped her days most profoundly. The binding they'd formed went deeper than either had fully anticipated. She could feel him even when they were apart, a constant awareness of his presence, like a second heartbeat echoing her own. And through that connection flowed emotions, thoughts, the wordless communication that came from truly knowing another person's essential nature. 2 weeks after the ritual, they sat together on a ridge overlooking the territory as the sun set in brilliant display of orange and purple. The view from here showed the forest stretching to distant mountains, a vast expanse of green marked here and there by clearings and streams. "It's working," Sera said quietly. "I can feel the difference. The land is healing." Slowly, King Theron agreed. "But yes, the binding holds, the restoration proceeds." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "And you're stronger than when we started, more confident in your abilities. I have a good teacher. You have natural talent. I'm simply helping you recognize what was always there." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, both of them aware of the bond humming contentedly between them. Finally, King Theron spoke again, his voice careful. "I need to return to the Northern Territories soon. My absence has been noted, and there are matters that require my attention. But the binding we formed means I cannot stay away long. Too much distance weakens the connection." Sera's heart clenched at the thought of his departure, though she'd known it was coming. "How long will you be gone?" "A few weeks at most. Long enough to settle urgent business and make arrangements." He hesitated, then continued. "I had thought to ask if you would consider coming with me. The Northern Territories have resources for training Lumina that don't exist here. Elders who remember the old ways, texts that were preserved when others were destroyed. Leave the Eastern Pack?" The thought was both terrifying and tempting. "This is my home. It will always be your home. The binding ensures that. But home can be more than one place, Sera, and you've outgrown the limitations this territory places on you." Before she could respond, movement in the valley below caught their attention. A rider approaching fast, dust rising from pounding hooves. Even from distance, Sera recognized the urgency in the rider's posture. They descended to meet the messenger, who proved to be one of Alpha Garrett's runners. His face was pale, his breathing labored from hard riding. "Alpha Garrett requests your immediate presence," he gasped out. "There's been an incident. Beta Ravens and his supporters have taken Mira hostage. They're demanding that the Lumina binding be dissolved and Sera exiled, or they'll kill her." Cold rage flooded through Sera, sharp and clarifying. Through the bond, she felt King Theron's matching fury, controlled but absolute. "Where are they?" King Theron's voice was deadly calm. "The old grain warehouse at the territory's eastern edge. They've barricaded themselves inside." They rode hard toward the warehouse, collecting Alpha Garrett and a contingent of guards along the way. By the time they arrived, full darkness had fallen, and the warehouse loomed like a malevolent presence against the starlit sky. Raven stood in the doorway, a knife pressed to Mira's throat. Her face was bruised, evidence of rough handling, but her eyes were defiant rather than afraid. "We've tried negotiation," Garrett said quietly to King Theron and Sera. "He won't listen to reason. He claims the binding has cursed the pack, that Sera must be removed before worse disaster strikes." King Theron's expression was carved from ice. "How many are with him?" 6 others inside, all beta males, all loyal to Raven's faction. They're armed and desperate. Sera studied the situation, her mind racing. A direct assault would likely result in Mira's death. Ravens was unstable enough to follow through on his threat, and his supporters were true believers in their cause. But perhaps there was another way. "Let me go in," she said quietly. "Alone, unarmed. Let me talk to him." "Absolutely not," King Theron said immediately. "It's too dangerous." "She's already in danger because of me." Sera met his gaze steadily. "And I have abilities Ravens doesn't understand. Let me try." The bond between them carried her determination, her certainty that this was the right approach. King Theron struggled visibly with the decision before finally nodding reluctantly. "If he harms you, I will end him." It wasn't a threat but a statement of absolute fact. Sera approached the warehouse alone, her hands raised and empty, showing she carried no weapons. Ravens watched her come, suspicion and hatred warring across his features. "Come to surrender," he called out mockingly. "Finally accept that you don't belong here?" "I've come to talk, to offer you a choice before this ends badly for everyone." "There's nothing to discuss. You're unnatural, wrong. The pack was right to reject you, and Garrett was a fool to allow your corruption to spread." Sera stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to speak normally, but far enough that he couldn't reach her without releasing Mira. Behind Ravens, she could see 6 other wolves crowded in the warehouse doorway, their faces showing mixture of fear and resolve. "You're afraid," she said quietly. Not of me, but of change, of losing the certainty you've built your life around. I understand that, Ravens. Change is terrifying. Don't presume to understand anything about me, witch. But I do understand. Through the binding, I feel what the pack feels. Your fear isn't unique. Many share it. The difference is that most are willing to question whether their fear is justified. She took a slow breath and reached for the power the binding had given her, not aggressively, but gently. She extended her awareness, feeling for the connections that bound all pack members together, the invisible threads of relationship and shared experience that created community. And she found Raven's thread, twisted and dark with rage and terror, but still connected, still part of the web. "You claim I'm dangerous," she continued, her voice taking on resonance that came from speaking with the land's authority behind her. "So let me show you what my power truly does." She channeled energy through their connection, not forcing or compelling, but offering him a glimpse of what she felt when connected to the land. The vast web of interdependence that sustained all life, the beauty of systems in balance, the peace that came from accepting one's place within something larger than individual ego. For just a moment, Raven's expression shifted. The hatred flickered, and beneath it she saw what drove him. Not evil, but fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that the old ways he'd devoted his life to upholding would be proven wrong. Fear that if he accepted change, everything he'd believed would crumble to dust. She felt compassion surge through her, unexpected and profound. Ravens had hurt her, humiliated her, made her life miserable for years. But he was still pack, still part of the web she'd pledged to serve. "You don't have to be afraid," she said gently. "There's room in the new way for those who serve the old way. No one's asking you to become something you're not. We're asking you to expand what you are." For one heartbeat, she thought she'd reached him. His grip on Mira loosened slightly, the knife pulling back from her throat by crucial inches. Then one of his supporters spoke from behind, his voice harsh and frightened. "Don't listen to her, Ravens. It's a trick. She's using magic to confuse you." The spell broke. Raven's face hardened again, and the knife pressed back against Mira's throat. "This is exactly what I mean. You corrupt with your very presence. You make us doubt ourselves, question everything we know to be true. Or perhaps you're simply discovering that what you thought you knew was incomplete." Sera took another step forward, gambling everything on her ability to reach him. "Ravens, let Mira go. Accept that change is coming whether you fight it or not. Help shape that change instead of being destroyed by resistance to it." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Then everything happened at once. One of Raven's supporters, more frightened than loyal, broke and ran from the warehouse. His sudden movement startled Ravens, who turned reflexively to shout at the deserter. In that moment of distraction, Mira drove her elbow hard into his stomach and dropped like a stone, rolling away from his loosened grip. King Theron exploded forward with supernatural speed, covering the distance before Ravens could recover. His hand closed around the beta's wrist, applying pressure that made bones creak and the knife clatter to the ground. The other supporters scattered, their resolve crumbling without Raven's leadership to sustain it. Within moments, it was over. Mira was safe, Ravens was subdued, and the brief rebellion had collapsed like morning mist before the sun. Alpha Garrett's guards moved in, securing Ravens and rounding up his fleeing supporters. The beta would face pack justice for his actions, though Sera suspected the punishment would be exile rather than death. Garrett had learned that mercy could be stronger than cruelty when applied with wisdom. Mira threw herself at Sera, embracing her fiercely. "I knew you'd come. Knew you wouldn't let them hurt me. I'm sorry you were caught up in this." Sera returned the embrace, relief flooding through her. "You shouldn't have been in danger because of me." "Don't apologize for existing," Mira said fiercely, pulling back to meet Sera's eyes. "You're the best thing that's happened to this pack in years. Anyone with sense can see that." The incident marked a turning point. Those who'd been uncertain about Sera saw her risk herself for a friend. Those who'd feared her power saw her use it for healing rather than harm. And those who'd supported Ravens found their leader discredited, his predictions of disaster proven false. Even Celeste, who'd watched Sera's elevation with cold resentment, approached her days later in the forest. The Alpha's daughter said nothing at first, simply stood among the trees where Sera worked to heal corrupted ground. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying neither warmth nor hostility, simply acknowledgement. "You saved my father from his own blindness. That matters more than pride." Celeste turned to leave, then paused. "He's a better alpha now than he was. Perhaps I can learn the same lesson." It wasn't friendship, but it was respect, earned through action rather than demanded by hierarchy. And sometimes respect was more valuable than affection. In the weeks that followed, acceptance grew. Not universal, probably never would be, but substantial enough that Sera could move through pack lands without constant hostility. Young wolves sought her out for training. Elders asked her to preserve their stories in journals like her grandmother had done. Common pack members simply treated her with the respect any useful member deserved. And through it all, King Theron remained, though both knew his departure approached. The Northern Territories needed their king, and messengers had begun arriving with increasing frequency, bearing reports of matters that required his attention. The binding they'd formed meant his absence couldn't be permanent, but duty called him home. 3 weeks after the ritual, on an evening when the stars seemed particularly bright, they met on their ridge overlooking the territory. The forest below rustled with sounds of healthy wilderness, a marked improvement from the dying silence that had preceded the binding. "Come with me," King Theron said without preamble. "Not forever, not yet, but come see the Northern Territories. Meet the elders who can teach you things I cannot. Learn what resources are available to you." Sera had been expecting the invitation, had been wrestling with her response for days. Part of her wanted desperately to stay, to continue the work she'd begun here. But another part recognized that she'd outgrown the limitations of a single territory. "How long would we be gone? Months, perhaps. Long enough for proper training. Then we return, and you continue the restoration here with deeper knowledge and stronger skills." She looked out over the forest she'd pledged to guard, feeling the land's presence through the binding. It whispered encouragement, urged her toward growth rather than stagnation. And through the bond with King Theron, she felt his hope that she would agree, his desire for her company that went beyond practical considerations of training. In the 2 weeks since the binding ritual, something had shifted between them. The forced intimacy of their connection had created foundation for something deeper. She knew him now in ways that bypassed normal courtship, knew his essential nature, and found it worthy of trust and respect. And through the bond, she felt his regard for her, his admiration for her courage, his growing affection that neither of them had named but both acknowledged. "I'll come," she said finally, "but I return before winter. The land needs consistent presence during the cold months." Agreed. King Theron's relief was palpable through their connection. "We leave in 3 days. That gives you time to make arrangements with Alpha Garrett and ensure the territory will be maintained in your absence." The 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Garrett assured her that he would honor the binding's requirements, that the restoration work would continue even without her constant presence. Mira promised to watch over things and send word if any crisis emerged. And the pack, or at least the majority of it, accepted her temporary departure with equanimity. On the morning of their departure, Sera stood once more at her grandmother's grave. She placed fresh flowers on the stone and spoke quietly to the woman who'd shaped so much of her life. "I understand now why you did what you did, why you hid me, protected me, gave everything to keep me safe until I was strong enough to defend myself." She touched the wooden wolf pendant that still hung around her neck. "I'll honor your legacy, grandmother. I'll remember what you tried to teach me, and I'll make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain." The wind whispered through the trees, and for just a moment, Sera could have sworn she heard Lyanna's voice on the breeze. "Fly, little one, fly and become everything I knew you could be." King Theron waited in the courtyard with their horses saddled and supplies packed. He wore traveling clothes, and his expression carried mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. Behind him, a small contingent of his guards prepared for the journey north. Alpha Garrett emerged to see them off, accompanied by council members and a significant portion of the pack. The gathering was respectful, almost ceremonial, marking the departure of someone important rather than the exile of someone unwanted. "You leave with our gratitude and respect," Garrett said formally, addressing Sera directly. "You've given us hope when we'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Safe travels, Lumina Guardian. Return to us stronger and wiser." The title he used, Lumina Guardian, marked her new status. No longer broken Omega, but recognized protector, valued member of the pack with unique role and authority. Sera mounted Ember, settling into the saddle with confidence born of practice. She looked around at the faces watching her departure, seeing mixture of expressions. Some showed lingering doubt, others genuine affection, most simple acceptance of her place among them. She'd spent 3 years desperate for acceptance, willing to diminish herself to earn even scraps of approval. But true acceptance hadn't come from making herself smaller. It had come from claiming her full nature, from refusing to be defined by others' limited understanding. King Theron guided his stallion beside Ember, and together they turned toward the forest path that would take them north. The binding hummed contentedly between them, connecting her to land and partner both, defining a future she would help create rather than one dictated by others' limitations. Behind them, the eastern pack watched until they disappeared among the trees. Ahead, the northern territories waited with mysteries and challenges that would test everything she'd learned. The forest closed around them, green and alive and whispering welcome. And Sera smiled, finally traveling as herself, whole and unashamed, toward whatever came next.